When in trouble, compete. What's in trouble? It's our system of democracy with so-called free markets, democracies where people vote, representatives. We have a little bit of federalism. We have three branches of government, a system that has been introduced in the sort of 18th century and then fought for in wars in the US and then later on in Europe. This system is in danger. So my suggestion here is that the way to solve this problem is to create more federalism, more excuse me, more entities that are self-regulated, self-sufficient, and self-governing, and then we have some sort of overlay that connects those entities. In other words, for example, free movement of people and capital and protection. Those are the critical overlays. This would be my suggestion as far as the crisis that we have in our what we call liberal democracy. Here's why this is important. Okay, the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund, right? So why am I now talking about constitutional law or the theory of government or things like that? Well, obviously, we can't function in an economy, make money, create wealth if people aren't organized. We have to organize ourselves the same way you have to organize your own family or your own little maybe community or your own state. You have to organize an economy. A company has to be organized, managed. It matters who runs companies. There's a couple of interesting ideas floating around on how actually to organize ourselves. When I say ourselves, I mean society in general. And I think more of the sort of Western liberal democracies. So this is not a conversation about North Korea or Russia or things like that, because it is a conclusion, at least from our perspective, that those are not desirable forms of government. So what we're suggesting is, in a nutshell, more competition. And more competition because of two reasons. Competition makes people stronger and more agile, more vigilant, more pretty much anything. And second, also, it helps create a laboratory for ideas. So, for example, if we had a little bit more federalism in the US, in other words, if we had entities in the US, let's say states like the Free State Movement in New Hampshire, if we had more of that, if we had a state where, DeSantis is governing, and another state where Bernie Sanders is governing, and then one where, let's say, the Free State Movement on New Hampshire. So you had different states, and if you have free movement of people and capital, you can choose where to live. You can choose where to live, and then we can see how these things pan out. And those types of entities, they could choose to have also different monies. One entity could have Bitcoin, and another entity could have the US dollar governed by the Fed, and so on and so forth. I've spoken about this in the past. Imagine you split the United States in two. One has Bitcoin, the other has US dollar. I think over 50 to 70 years, you would have similar dynamics like you had in East Germany and West Germany. So this just as a tangent. So the purpose of this particular episode is to discuss these ideas, to hopefully find solutions. Where we don't have a particular goal here to deliver solutions, to go to some sort of court and try to implement our solutions, anything like that. This is a lot more of a nudging, and like I said, we are in the business of creating wealth, and thinking about how government should be organized is certainly not the first item on the agenda typically, but it's important, particularly in times like this, when we have distress, and I'm going to talk about what the actual distress is, and again, what our solutions are. This is not In Wrong Podcast. It's April 12, 2023. This is Krim Delco. Since the last update, we're down 6%. The market is down 0.5% for the year. We are up 45.6%. The market is up 7.6%. We're outperforming by 38 So first, let's talk about the crisis. The crisis of liberal democracy is that people are pissed off. And I'm paraphrasing Martin Wolf, whose engagement in this topic is laudable. I think his ideas are, although not very interesting, and I'm going to talk about this too, but I'm just paraphrasing him. People are pissed off. I think that's true. I think that's I would second that. And here's also why the problem. The problem is that for some reason we went from equal rights and one vote, one man to some sort of entitlement of dignity and success. So capitalism, free liberal democracy has created a lot of desirable situation, and the actual, what I mean for people, of course, and in the actual, let's say, the carrot that was pulling the donkey, which was this idea that everybody can make it. Everybody has a chance, particularly in the United States. Everybody has a shot. This particular carrot now is turning into a problem because we went from, hey, everybody has a shot to everybody is entitled to actually win. And that, of course, doesn't work. That's why the woke movement has invoked the equity concept. Equity means equal outcomes, okay? That's what equity means. And equity doesn't work because you just can't have equal outcomes. It's impossible to have that. It's mathematically impossible. So it's a pretext to some sort of wealth distribution. And then we have a class struggle, and we're back to Marx and Lenin. And I spoke about this when I spoke about Lenin and his biography in his book, Why is Lenin so relevant today? Well, it's because people have this false notion that they can somehow go for equity, and equity is not achievable, so you will have a doctrine that is not sustainable, and then you have the risk of ending up in a totalitarian regime. This is kind of the conclusion of why Lenin and Marx and all these people are back on vogue, particularly on the left. By the way, this is not just a left thing. I mean, it's on both sides of the aisle. The idea of having entitlement is a little bit different when it gets expressed on the other side of the aisle, on the right side. There, it's more about, well, I have the right of my land, and I protect my dignity with my gun. But then, if I lose my land because I don't have money, well, then I go and fight because that's my God-given right to own this land. So it's not very different, to be honest, the right and the left. That's why we're not suggesting just go vote for DeSantis or vote for whatever. We're suggesting a new system. I mean, this is exactly the sort of the conclusion of the problem is that the political sphere is so intoxicated that we just can't go on. Another problem is, of course, money. We have too much debt in the Western world. It's not just the US, it's Europe and also Japan. And interesting, this is just a tangent. Well, Japan was imposed a system after World War II. And if you're Japanese, you're like, listen, you want me to live like this? Fine, I'll do it. And I'll screw up big time because what you're suggesting here doesn't work. It doesn't work in our country. Actually, it doesn't work. This is what they probably are telling themselves. Well, okay, fine. We're just going to borrow 5 times GDP and, support our elderly and basically create a sclerosis economy. And this is what we have. The Europeans have their own issues. They're obsessed with not having another World War II. But in the end, the result is the same. Borrow, 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 and just pay people not to work and just pretend to be wealthy when, in fact, of course, they're not wealthy. So those are kind of the big 3 blocks of Western liberal democracy that are all crumbling. Now, the one place where we think there's hope is, as usual, is the United States. And the reason there's hope is because the structure of the United States lends itself for the experiment that we're suggesting, and that is to have more federalism and competition between entities. This is what we're suggesting. So we're suggesting that we have a lot more autonomous entities In other words, we have an independent Florida, an independent New England, an independent California, and so on and so forth. Now, how far down we go, that's part of the discussion here that we're trying to initiate. So I'm very grateful for comments. Should we go down to the community level? Should we have little states, cities? That's up for grabs, because here's why. I mean, things have changed, obviously, in the last 300 years since Montesquieu and Jefferson and all these people wrote up what we have, what we call the U.S. Constitution today, and all the other constitutions in Europe. So for example, we have a digital economy. We're a lot more flexible. So you could live in, let's say, a free state of New England run by Bernie Sanders and work for a digital enterprise in Europe or in California or in Japan. I mean, you weren't able to do that 300 years ago. You can do that pretty easily today. You should be able to, if we have these types of entities, then of course it's incredibly important to have free movement of people and capital. If we don't have a free movement of people and capital, then the whole idea, of course, crumbles, because then you're just a hostage of the place where you live, and that's not a good idea. We also want to have autonomy. So this is not the Europe system where we have free movement of people and capital, but everything is centralized, of course. The EU system. That's not the idea. That's not a good idea either. We need free experiments. This is, I'm jumping here, but why do I want to have more entities? Well, there's two reasons. One is it's a lot better to govern smaller entities, but much more importantly, we can experiment. I just said it. I kind of nudged where I'm going here. One, let's say New England is run by Bernie Sanders. So we have this, call it tolerant, collectivist thinking that proliferates throughout New England. People live there, maybe a little bit like Scandinavia, very high taxes, socialism, and maybe also wealth. It's possible. These are smart people. They have good universities. There's some industries there. So why not? So this would be one option. Then we have, Florida and DeSantis, which is going to be a very conservative, very business-friendly state. Maybe almost on the verge of a and I wouldn't use the word fascism, of course, but something along those lines. But again, you're free to move. And you're not going to be jailed. You're going to follow the law. And if you're not allowed to use the word gay, then you're not allowed to use the word gay. So be it. Again, it's all about moving your feet and your money where you want to live. California is California. It's a little bit of showmanship, lots of technology, lots of entrepreneurs, lots of immigrants. That's what what is California really? Silicon Valley is just a lot of immigrants. Silicon Valley is not a bunch of white people sitting on money or something like that. There's old money there like everywhere else. It's Indians and Chinese people. That's what Silicon Valley really is. So it's a very open place for the best of the best in their areas. And quite frankly, it's a place where people like to sit in coffee shops and discuss inventions of programming languages. That's really what Silicon Valley is all about. So if you want to be that type of person, if you want to go and drink a Honduras single origin coffee for $8 and discuss the merits of Ruby versus Python when it comes to, let's say, crypto programming, if that's your passion, that you shouldn't be living in a Bernie Sanders state in New England, or in Florida or somewhere like that. You should be living in California. So again, hopefully I'm getting the point clear here, that it is about experimentation and it is about choice. Experimentation and choice. We don't have a good theory of politics in this 21st century. There's a couple of ideas. We have the Free State Movement in New Hampshire. We have the digital state by this guy, I forgot, he wrote a book 20 years ago, but this sort of network state type thing, which is not clear to me, but let's put that aside. We have some what's the word, sprouts or green shoots in places like Nevada and Utah. Of course, these are places where communities experiment all the time with very local self-governance, just given the nature of these geographies. It makes sense for, let's say, the government in Carson City, Nevada, to give some community, 10 hours away somewhere in the desert, more self-governance, because what are you going to do? Send their troops there if there's a problem? Like, just govern yourself. It's fine. And now, there's a couple of things that need to be discussed. I mean, I think the idea, hopefully, it's not very complicated, and that's why it's such a good idea. This is parsimony at its best. We have more competition, we have more entities, and we have free movement of people and capital. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we make free movement of people and capital? Like, how does that actually work? So you live in New England, you get paid by people's taxes to educate yourself, and then you go to California to make money. I mean, you know where I'm going here. So how do you align the incentives? And then also, how do you deal with protection? This is a big one, okay? So let's talk about the incentives. Now, the incentives in terms of staying there, getting paid for this and that, I think we've seen in, let's say, places like Switzerland or even the United States today that, the UC system of California, the University of California system, is a very, very good, a relatively public university. But what I mean with relative is it's not fully free, but it's certainly not as expensive as going to a private university. You can go to Berkeley, UCLA, UC Davis, and so on and so forth, and get a very good education. Most people stay in California. If you have a strong education system, typically you will also retain labor, you will retain investment, you will retain. These things go in line. We said that many times. Liberty, knowledge creation, and wealth creation are all sides of the same thing. And therefore, I think if you give yourself enough leeway to keep, to educate the people and give them a good lifestyle and all that, then they will stay. So that's the best way you can create an incentive. But again, I mean, this is the beauty of, excuse me, there's a construction right next to me here. This is the beauty of this whole idea that, let's experiment, let's see how these things pan out in the marketplace of people. People have the choice to go, and I think we would have a Cambrian age of new political systems. We have this whole idea of cryptocurrency also. You could have, let's say, an entity in Nevada that also uses cryptocurrency to align incentives. So if you build solar system in your community, you can use crypto to incentivize people to participate. And if they do participate, then they get paid a little bit more than if they don't participate. And that's for a whole nother podcast. But crypto as a whole, or Web3, what people call Web3, is actually an alignment system for incentives. That's what crypto actually is. And therefore, you could have these types of experiments also with money. You could have a system where there's central bank money, another system where there's private money. We had all these things in the past, by the way. We had private money issued by banks in the British Empire. We have the gold standard. You could have the gold standard in certain places. So there's a lot of different ways to organize the economy, organize the country. In terms of voting, there's people like Safedin Ammous. They talk about monarchies and things like that, which is actually an interesting thought. If you think about it, we could have something like a renaissance of feudalism, because we have the idea of a private business, a family business that actually knows how to run a country. And if you're free to move and all that, then there's not going to be a lot of coercion. So this is kind of along the lines of Liechtenstein and that kind of thing. But of course, even Liechtenstein is more of a constitutional monarchy, so it's not really the same thing. So my point here is, how do you choose the leaders? Okay, this is, again, a whole other episode. And I want to stay deliberately vague here, because I think by introducing more entities and more experimentation, let the market decide. Here, over here, we have representative democracy. Over there, we have feudalism. Over here, we have, I don't know, more of a direct democracy like Switzerland, and so on and so forth. Look, what we're suggesting here, by the way, it's not all reinventing the wheel. A lot of these things have been done before. Switzerland, United States. What we're suggesting is just a decentralization of governance and more self-governance on smaller entities, because we have a crisis and we need new ideas, and the best way to get new ideas is to experiment with new entities. So this is what we're suggesting. Last thing, of course, is protection. That's a big one, because we can't have small entities across the world governing themselves. And again, I grew up in Switzerland, so I know what I'm talking about. No matter how wealthy you are, if you're small, you can't fight a giant like China or Russia that has hundreds of thousands of coerced or poor or whatever soldiers that they can send into war like cannon fodder. And you don't have that luxury, particularly not in a small, wealthy state. So that again is a whole other episode. But I just want to say a few things here. One, there's ways to protect yourself through cooperation, a little bit like an insurance. So like a Federal Reserve, you could have some sort of federal, a reserve army. Of course, the risk of centralization there, risk of the military-industrial complex comes up and all of that. So it's certainly a difficult problem to solve, because here's why. If you stare the monster in the eye, make sure you don't become the monster. In other words, if you organize yourself to fight a monster like the Chinese or the Russian aggression, the chances you become the monster yourself are very high. So this is you can define a society by its enemies, because it's going to organize itself by the heartbeat of its enemies. If your enemy is a totalitarian regime run through a central government in China, you're going to have to find ways to centralize, right? You can't, again, Switzerland cannot fight China. An independent state of New England run by Bernie Sanders cannot fight China. Taiwan can't fight China, for God's sake. So that is another problem that needs to be solved, and I think that's a difficult problem to be solved. And let me formulate the problem here. The problem is not, okay, should we have an army with fighter jets or just intercontinental missiles or something like that? That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a lot more subtle questions along the lines of, okay, how can you protect yourself against a centrally governed aggressive entity while at the same time not being a centrally governed entity? That's the problem. How can you contain the monster without becoming the monster yourself? That's the problem. How can you contain the monster without becoming the monster yourself? That's the problem. And I have a few ideas here, which is you can create, you can kind of use software here. What I mean is something that Elon Musk once suggested. How about we have rules and regulations and laws and things along those lines that expire? I mean, that would be a good start. So let's say if we have a budget for the army, it expires and it has to be renewed. So at least there is a necessity for whoever is spending that budget to justify. I guess a more general way to think about this is also if you have mission creep. The problem with central entities and central government and all of these things is always mission creep. I mean, not always, but that's part of it. That's what Dwight Eisenhower was alluding to. And how do you prevent mission creep? But again, this is not for this episode. This is on its own, I think, worth studying. Okay, how can you protect yourself? How can you stare the monster in the face without becoming the monster yourself? This is the fundamental question. So to summarize, we have a suggestion for how to solve the identity crisis of liberal democracies in the West, which is we suggest more competition between legal entities, between states. We suggest more independent states, more federalism, with a free flow of people and capital, so then we can have a choice and more experimentation in how people are governed. Governance is relevant, it's important, it's the key to wealth creation. That's why it matters, that's why we're discussing it here at Orange Capital Partners. We don't have good governance now, even in the United States. We have checks and balances and things like that, but how about we have more checks and balances? And the best checks and balances is competition. When in crisis, more competition is always a better choice. The constraints are protection. The constraints are, of course, also how do you protect, let's say, things like property rights within your system. So there's a lot of open questions, a lot of good problems to be solved, but this is a good start. Thank you.